So we are recording. Good. Hi, welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning for our program. My name is Laura Christensen. I'm the curator of manuscripts and archives here at the Thomas Balch Library, and we're very pleased this morning to offer our program, Researching African American Genealogy, with our presenters, Steve Hammond and Lori Kimball. I'm going to turn it over to them. We will have questions and answers at the end of the program. If you feel like you'd like to share questions throughout, please enter them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will collect and moderate them. Everybody's questions will be addressed. If you are having technical difficulties, please email balchlib, it's BALCHLIB at leesburgva.gov, and we have my wonderful colleague Nora, who is there to help you with technical difficulties. I'm also happy to try and help. If you are having major problems or you get interrupted, please know we are recording the program, so it will be made available afterwards. We will send you a link. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve Hammond and hope you enjoy the program.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited about being able to provide this presentation to you. I'm excited to work with my good friend, Lori Kimball, and to be able to share some of the things that we have been working on and like to share with others as you begin your journey to think about, researching your family history. My background is that I've basically been researching my family history for about 50 years, if you can believe that. And I'm hoping to be able to share with you today some of the things that I've learned, coupled with doing that through some case studies. So why don't we go ahead and just try to get started here, see if my computer will catch up with me. There we go. So we will break this up into a couple of different portions, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But I did want to acknowledge the indigenous lands that we're on. I wanted to read a statement for you in terms of the work that I do and the ancestors that I want to honor as a part of this work that I'm doing. My ancestors lived, worked, and died on land shown on this slide that we know today as the United States. In Virginia, my ancestors lived on the traditional territory and homelands of the Powhatan Nation. In Louisiana, my ancestors lived on the traditional territory and homelands of the Chitimacha Nation. And in Mississippi, my ancestors lived on the traditional territory and homelands of the Choctaw Nation. I acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of these regions with their vibrancy and their connection to the land. I support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to cover today in the time that we have to spend together. I hope that, as Laura said, that you'll put in your questions and comments, but I would also suggest that perhaps you want to take out a pencil and paper so that you can jot down some of the things that we're going to talk about today, because you may need them. Hopefully the recording will be available and you can watch this again and be able to pull things out of it. But I would be prepared to write some things down as we go today. So the material that we're sharing today is, I would say, geared a little bit more towards the beginner who's not quite sure what they want to do. But I think that there really is content here for everyone who is interested in this particular hobby or area of research. I'm going to start the work that we have today by offering some suggestions and some strategies in terms of how you can approach your family history and genealogical research. I'm going to share a total of 3 case studies. The first 2 will be on a couple of my family members, William Syphax and Charles Syphax here in Virginia. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lori to talk about some of the work that she's been doing, and as well as helping you understand materials and information you can find here in Loudoun County. And then we'll finish the day talking about genetic genealogy, a little more complex area of study, but something that I thought you all would enjoy and get something out of in terms of how you might think of doing the work that you want to do. So we're going to hold questions and answers until the end. But again, we want you to be able to put those things into the chat box so that Laura can help facilitate answering as many of those questions as we can at the end. So why research my own family history and share their story? These are the reasons why I take on this work. You know, my goal is to seek the truth and to provide clarity. When I was first introduced to my family history, you know, I just could not believe that we, you know, had a connection to the first family of the United States, which is really pretty incredible. So part of the interest that I had was trying to separate fact from fiction and from folklore. And so that's one of the things that's really driven me as a scientist professionally. I'm into data, and so for me, it's about trying to you know, use forensic truth and couple that with personal truths to help tell a full story. You know, I really want to honor and remember my family members. You know, those are the people whose shoulders I stand on, and I think that we owe them a great deal in terms of allowing us to be in this space today. My goal is to expand personal knowledge, but also to inspire folks like yourselves to help educate others who may not have knowledge about some of the things that people have done and how some of our history actually fits together, and to try to fill gaps that I think still exist in our history. And the goal here is really to share the narrative of family members that just hasn't been discovered or needs to be rediscovered. So I think this is a good way to set some context. You know, if you look at this pedigree chart, this is my pedigree chart. I am the black box down there in the center of this slide. And you can see as we look 6 generations back, we can see how many people it took to make us who we are. So if you add all those people up over 6 generations, it comes out to 126 potentially individual ancestors. Now, it's possible that, you know, some people may be related to you twice in different ways, so the number might be less than 126, but if everybody was unique, it would be about 126 people. So there's a lot of work to do to try to, you know, figure out what our families look like and how we were connected to. So at last count, my Hammond online genealogy database had over 4,000 people in it, 4,500, a lot of folks. But if we look at this next piece, I only know about 26 of those 126 ancestors that I've been searching for, which are part of my direct pedigree. It's a stark, I think, message in terms of what it takes. And so you can see down there on the bottom graphic, those people in the black boxes are the people who I have names for, people who I know something about. And all of those that are still pink and blue are names that I have yet to discover. So even over the 50-year career, 50-year hobby that I've had here, there is a tremendous amount of work that I've accomplished, but there's also a lot of work to take on. But the one thing that I want you to notice about that bottom graphic is that dashed line that cuts across there. If you stop and think about that, you know, it's a couple of generations back from me. That line is 1870. And 1870, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, is really reflective of African American history in terms of some of those brick walls that we hit as a result of the difficulties in terms of finding people before that time. And you can really see a stark difference there, that many of the places where my gaps begin to show up are right at 1870. And so it really complicates things as you're looking for people prior to that time. So how do we go about researching African American history? Well, it's not that different than researching any genealogy, but the tools are going to be the same, but there are clearly more challenges because there's more gaps in the information. You know, the first census where we have, you know, names of African Americans in the census is 1870 for those, everyone that was freed. There are cases that as I'll show you in a couple of minutes, of free blacks that were in the census prior to 1870, but that brick wall really creates some challenges when it comes to trying to determine where people were and who they were associated with. Those gaps can be frustrating at times, but for me, that is a part of the challenge that I see, that I embrace, and really what it takes to help overcome those. They don't happen overnight. It's not something that you'll be able to solve immediately in some cases. In some cases, you may never be able to solve them. But those are things that we need to take on one at a time in a consistent way to try to create some answers. It involves a lot of work, and it is in fact challenging. And then the last thing there is that the patience and persistence really pays off. And even today, I would say in the last 6 months, I've had several situations where I've been able to break through brick walls, which has really been pretty exhilarating. So as you begin your work, I think it's really important that you ask yourself, what do you want to accomplish? What do you want to get out of your family history research? And that means asking yourselves, so what kind of products am I going to produce here? You need to determine your objectives. And so what I have here are, 2 or 3 items here that you might think about as you're pondering what it is. Do you want a pedigree chart like the one I showed you in the last couple of slides? It shows your, 6 generations back and the people that you have there. You simply want to know what their names were and when they were born and where they were at and who they married. Are you interested in building a family tree? It's like there in the bottom left-hand corner. We'll talk a little bit more about my Syphax family tree as we proceed here. But, for us, this has taken decades to pull together. And it's a pretty comprehensive tree. It has hundreds of people on this particular tree. And we know a lot of the stories that have been teased out as a result of that. And on the right-hand side is a biography. Perhaps you want to write something about your family or the history of your family. So those are, depending on what it is that you're after, it kind of sets the tone in terms of how you're going to go about some of the work that you're going to be taking on. So where do you start when you think about all this? Well, for me, you have to decide what it is that you want to know. It goes back to that last slide that we talked about. What are you after? And the recommendation that I make to you is start with the present. We are given stories as we grow up. Sometimes we hear those stories, sometimes we don't. But what you need to do is start with the present. So in these circles on the right-hand side, you can see that there are 3 concentric circles. And I say start with what we know. Those are the things that, like when your mom and dad got married, and when you had your kids, and when your cousins were born and where they lived. Those are things that we know as a result of our experiences. But then there's this next larger box, which kind of encompasses those things that are the questions, what we know that we don't know. So maybe we don't know the year that our mom and dad got married. Or maybe we know that they had brothers and sisters, but we don't know all their names. Or perhaps there were brothers and sisters that passed away before we started learning about the folklore. So those are questions that we want to try to answer as we increase our knowledge about our family history. And then the third and larger box is the questions of, what we know that we don't know, or what we don't know that we don't know. There are, as you go, there are going to be questions that come up that just say, wow, that's something that I had no idea. Or as we begin to make the box larger and we answer some of those questions that we know that we didn't know, this larger piece comes up where there are more questions that lead you to places that you would have never thought in terms of learning about your history. So the key here, I think, is to begin to separate facts from fiction, to lay out a research strategy. Again, what it is that you want to know, and think about the trail that you want to follow to get there. You want to obtain information from other sources and seek help. I have a study buddy, which is a second cousin of mine. We've been doing this for about 30 years, and it just makes this so much more enjoyable when you're taking this ride with somebody else. So I would recommend that you buddy up, and that perhaps you join a society which has people who are knowledgeable that can, kind of help you along the way if you have questions. And I think it's really okay to ponder possibilities, but don't assume anything, because as soon as you do, you're liable to make errors and come up with information that simply is not correct. So some first thoughts about how we can look for genealogical records is that, the family Bible is an important piece. A lot of people have that. It's on the shelf, or Aunt Margaret has that, or somebody has it, and you're going to find births and deaths and all sorts of things that really help to fill in some of the gaps, or at least start to create a tree for you. The other piece that a lot of us have in our scrapbooks is our newspaper clippings. If you look at newspaper clippings, there's a ton of information that you can kind of start to glean from that will help you to tell and start to fill in the narrative of ancestors. Military records are amazing. There's a website called Fold3, FOLD3.com, that allows you to basically look at digitized records like the ones that we're seeing here. On the left is a digitized record of my distant cousin, Douglas Syphax. He actually was in the United States colored troops in the infantry, and he actually served in the Civil War. He actually was stationed right here in Alexandria and helped to support and protect what is known as the Arlington estate as it exists today. And on the right-hand side is William Thomas Syphax, who actually, he didn't fight in World War II, but he was a physicist. And it turns out that he was actually sent to Tuskegee. Now, we always hear about the Tuskegee Airmen, but William Thomas Syphax used his physics skills to help with communications in the United States. So there's so many pieces of history here. And especially when you think he went to Tuskegee, you immediately think of Tuskegee Airmen, but his narrative is much different. And so there's ways to, as we begin to pull these kinds of records together, to be able to tease out new information. The other thing that I really like to think about is start with other things that you have nearby. On the right-hand side, you have photographs. Happens to be my mother in the back row on the left there. She's the first African-American nurse to graduate from the University of Colorado School of Nursing in 1946. So there's a powerful narrative there, but stories tell 1,000 words. And so pictures are an important part. Scrapbooks, letters, newspaper clippings, like you see in the center, are extremely important. And as young people are thinking about taking this on today, they're at a disadvantage because many of them didn't know how to, write in cursive. And so being able to translate these into analog text can be a challenge, but these kinds of things can be gold mines in terms of information we can learn about our ancestors, in terms of where they were, what was going on in their lives and in their society. And then on the left-hand side, which is probably one of the most important things, is who knows the folklore? Are you the family historian, or is there somebody else that perhaps is the family historian that's been doing this longer than you that may be able to help answer questions? And are there people with whom you can basically interview to be able to pull things together? Funeral programs. Oh my gosh, if you think about obituaries and funeral programs, there's a ton of information. They'll usually list, the immediate family, but they'll go on and talk about the nieces and nephews and sons-in-laws and daughters-in-laws and the connections that they have. So these are places that are extremely valuable. These are sources that are extremely valuable in terms of helping to piece together a tree. I can't tell you how many times I've used this to build a tree, especially as I'm thinking about the use in my DNA work, as I'm trying to build trees for people that I don't have a lot of information about. And you learn things about folks that have passed that we may have never have known otherwise. So the next thing I want to do is I want to kind of prepare you to talk about or share with you the case studies that I mentioned that we're going to talk about. This is a condensed family tree that I kind of want to just give you and orient you to give you some context of where I fit in this Syphax family tree. And on the bottom left-hand side, you can see me in the red circle. Hopefully you can see that. And if we work our way up, you can see 3 people on this slide that have stars next to them. And these are the people that I'm going to talk about in my case studies today. The first one at the top is William Syphax. He is my fourth great grandfather, lived in Alexandria, Virginia. The second star is my third great grand uncle. His name is Charles Syphax, and he actually was enslaved by George Washington Parke Custis at Arlington. And the third person further down, this is my great grandmother, Cora Joseph, and she actually lived in and was born in Mississippi, lived in New Orleans for many years. And we're going to talk about her with regard to DNA. So the first case study is William Syphax. And the things that I want to share with you about William really are to get you to think about how can we gather information and how can we put it together to mean something. And so this slide is intended to show you what I know and what have been taught with regard to the folklore of William Syphax. And on the right-hand side, the types of documents that we have assembled over time and that we continue to assemble as we learn more about William. You can see there that as part of the folklore, he came from Canada. This is a man who was born in 1773 or close to 1773. So trying to figure out whether he came from Canada or not is not an easy task. But the folklore says that he was from Canada, that he lived at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon, that he was an itinerant preacher in Alexandria. He fathered a number of children with an enslaved woman at Mount Vernon, and that his son Charles married the great granddaughter of Martha Washington. All pretty amazing items here for a person in terms of his life and the children that he had. And so the question for me is, how can we begin to test these, put this into some kind of context and try to determine, separate fact from fiction from the folklore. So one of the ways that we can do that based in this period, remember I said he was born in 1773. So the question would have been that this was a period in which many African Americans were enslaved. And in William's case, that is in fact the case. He was enslaved. We believe that perhaps he was free and enslaved and then freed himself again. But using documents that exist today that some people have already done a lot of work on, I'm using Dorothy Provine's example here, is that she has actually gone through the Negro registers in Alexandria to put together lists that make your job of finding your ancestors a lot easier. And so I want to show the example here of William Syphax, the registration number, that's number 409 that we have for William. It actually talks about in this registration, gives you describes William Syphax. It talks about his age, what his looks are, his complexion, he has a mole under his eye, it talks about who he was freed by. And it gives you some insight into this particular person. And it actually puts some dates around when some certain things happen. The other thing that's neat about registers like this is if you look at that centerpiece, the reference information, you can see how many other Syphaxes are a part of this. And so it allows you to start to build a tree where you may not have had one in terms of finding other people who were related to William and how they all fit together. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we have original documents that actually, this is William Syphax's, walking around registration paper. We talk about people who, African Americans who were free that needed to have a license to walk around. Well, this is an example of what he would have been required of him in Alexandria to be able to show that he was free if somebody asked. So the other thing that we can learn about William Syphax, which I suspect that some of you may be able to find, is that we actually have a deed that exists in the Alexandria Courthouse that shows that William Syphax was freed and when he was freed. And so this document shows William Syphax there in the center, upper center, his name, and then on the middle right-hand side, the people who owned him, that freed him, and the people on the left who basically attested to that. And so it's very interesting to me to be able to pull this together because these people have a relationship with one another. And if we're cagey enough, we can start to try to learn more about these people who knew William Syphax and perhaps how William Syphax's life fit into their lives. So what I have done is I've started using a principle that has been documented by other genealogists called the FAN principle. It stands for family, associates, and neighbors. And the principle is that you begin to look at those folks who are associated with, in this case, William Syphax, just like we were looking at on that manumission deed just a few moments ago. And we can start to identify people that lived and associated with these ancestors and start to learn more when there's not a lot of information about William Syphax, perhaps with these white folks that actually helped to free William Syphax, maybe we can tease out more information, come up with some new hints, researching other people that might reveal some things that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to determine and could help us break through a couple of brick walls. So if we think about what we just were looking at with the manumission document, one of the things that I did is I went back to the 1830 census and look, or excuse me, the 1820 census, and you can see all of those people that were a part of his 1817 manumission are listed here in the 1820 census. So we can start to get a sense for where they were and how they were related to one another and what kind of work perhaps they did. So this is actually from the 1820 census. The other thing that I like to do, and I would like to encourage you to do, and I personally think this is kind of fun, is to create a timeline. Sometimes it helps you to try to put into context the things that are going on at the time so that you can have a sense for how your ancestor fit into the picture. So I know I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but I want you to consider this as a tool that could help you, like when you're in the library or when you're on the road, you take a road trip to try to find an ancestor. By having these kinds of things at your fingertips, you can have a quick guide, a pocket guide that allows you to kind of recall some of those important facts that maybe you wouldn't think of otherwise. And in this particular case, we can see kind of when there were skirmishes, the wars. We can see when kind of the George and Martha Washington were doing things. We can see when William Syphax's children were being born. And we can also see those other people who were in the fan club that I was talking about. Over on the left-hand side, we have William Stabler. We have William Stabler's son, Edward Stabler. We have S. Wheeler and Barocas. Those were the two gentlemen that actually freed William Syphax. And then we have John Gadsby, George Washington, and John Carlisle, that kind of where they fit in and what kinds of things were going on in their lives. And then over on the right, bottom right, you can actually see that there was a city fire in Alexandria in 1827. Huge fire, damaged a tremendous amount of the city. Fortunately, records were not damaged, but there were many homes and things that were. But you know what? As a result of that, there are insurance records and other kinds of things that can help us to basically learn more about these people. So I recommend a timeline to use as a pocket guide that may be able to help guide your research. So I wanted to share with you really what the 1820 census looked like. The reason that William Syphax is even listed in the 1820 census is because he was free. He was freed in 1817, as I showed you just a couple of minutes ago. And as a result of that, and the head of the household, he is listed in the census. And the interesting thing about this particular census is it actually shows free whites, free white males, free white females, free black males, free black females, and enslaved females and males. And in this particular slide, or in this particular page of the census, you can see William Syphax at the top of the slide, and it actually over here on the right shows his wife, Lydia, as well as himself, as well as some of his children. Not all of them are listed here because they're out of the house at the time. But this is the earliest census that we've been able to find William Syphax, and these things tell stories. I point this out over here on the right because we have Sarah Herbert. Sarah Herbert, most people wouldn't know, but Sarah Herbert was the daughter of John Carlisle of the Carlisle House in Alexandria. And so this tells us, based on the folklore, I don't have time to show you the information that we have about this today, but William Syphax actually lived in the in a structure in the front of the Carlisle house. So it allows us to confirm some of this folklore and some of the things that we see in the newspapers, that these people, based on the census, they live next door to each other. You know, not in the same household, but they live next door to each other. So these things can help in terms of telling your story. The other thing is that we know William Syphax actually not only freed himself, but he also freed his children. I should go back and say, when I showed you that manumission document, what I didn't tell you is he actually purchased his own freedom. And we can see that here in a article that he was actually written about him. It says William Syphax, and it goes on to say he has already purchased his own freedom for $333. And it goes on to talk about his wife and multiple daughters. And then at the end, he says he wishes to raise $600 more that will liberate his whole family. A tremendous amount of information here to basically give us a sense for what William's life was like and what he was working on. And then we have also found two manumission documents where he's actually freed his wife, and in this one, three of his children, and then in another manumission document, two other of his children. So the work that we have done has led to these rediscoveries. I want to point out that these documents have always been in the courthouse, but we had to rediscover their availability as a result of the work that we've done. The other thing that I want to mention here is this connection with the fan club is you may recall that one of the people on the manumission was this William Stabler. And William Stabler was the son of Edward Stabler. And they were basically, I'm trying to think here. He worked in the apothecary shop there in Alexandria, and they were Quakers, and so they were abolitionists. And one of the really powerful documents that we have found, whoops, I want to go back. Let me go back. I don't want to go too far here too quickly, is that in 1835, William Stabler wrote a letter to two of his colleagues, one in Philadelphia and one in Baltimore, that was intended to help William Syphax, who was actually out trying to raise money for his family. He had gone north, but look what this letter says, and this is part of the richness of telling the story and the narrative, is that he was trying to find William Syphax because he wanted to keep him out of danger. He was worried that if he came back to Alexandria, that his life would be in danger because of the fact that he was out there passing out pamphlets, trying to raise money to free his children. So all of this creates a very, very rich narrative about William Syphax. And I would guess that many of you out there that are interested in learning about your family have stories very similar to this that are very rich in content. So that's a quick story about William Syphax. And now I want to tell you a little bit about his son, Charles. This is the man who I mentioned earlier that married the granddaughter of Martha Washington. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to kind of build a tree and think about the folklore and see where it fits in. And what we have here is we have the first family. And over on the right, we have Mariah Carter Custis. And if we start at the top of this, we can see Martha Washington, who, we know married George, but she also had a first husband who was named Daniel Parke Custis. They had a couple of children. And their son, John Parke Custis, had 4 children. And he died very young as he was working for George Washington as a part of the Revolution. And 2 of his children were actually raised by George and Martha Washington. One of them was George Washington Parke Custis. Well, George Washington Parke Custis basically had a daughter with Ariana Carter in 1803. There's no hard documentation that shows that. Our folklore has always said this. Our folklore has said that Ariana actually lived at Mount Vernon and was owned by the Washingtons, but we have no documentation that shows that. The records that Mount Vernon has don't support that, but we know that she was likely enslaved by either his mother's family, excuse me, his wife's family, Mary Lee Fitzhugh, or was owned in a local plantation by someone else. The point that I want to point out here, though, is that Mariah Carter was born to George Washington Parke Custis and Ariana Carter in 1803, and his white daughter was born in 1808. So Mariah basically helped to care for her older sister. In 1821, Mariah married Charles Syphax. In 1831, Mary Custis marries Robert E. Lee. So the Syphaxes and the Lees have a relationship through George Washington Parke Custis. And these two families were on extremely different trajectories. In 1825, after Mariah had her first two children, George Washington Parke Custis basically sold her. And who did he sell her to? Edward Stabler, the apothecary shop owner. Very, very interesting story here in terms of trying to unpack the history of this family. So at the same time, when George Washington Parke Custis sold Mariah, he also gave her 17 acres of property. And that property, if you think of what I'm showing you here, is a map of the Arlington plantation before it became Arlington National Cemetery. You know, we could show Arlington Cemetery plopped on top of this, but for the purposes today, I wanted to show you kind of the relationship of where the Syphax's 17 acres of property that was given to her by George Washington Parke Custis was in relationship with the mansion, which is way down on the south end, and where it was associated with the Freedmen's Village. There's a tremendous amount of history here it's waiting to be told in a better way. And by the way, I should say that the Arlington House, which is the mansion that George Washington Parke Custis built, is about to reopen by the National Park Service. So next week on June 8th, it's going to be reopening to the public. And the Syphax family and other descendants of the enslaved there at Arlington have been very involved in what's going on. So when you have an opportunity, I would recommend that you take an opportunity to go visit that, because the stories that are being told there are changing. It's not just about Robert E. Lee, it's more about all of those people that had an impact on the history of that site. But the thing that I want to share with you here is that once Mariah was freed, she lived on that property with her family, but her husband, Charles, remained enslaved. An amazing story. So Custis, I think, wanted her to be close, so he gave her the property. Her husband is still enslaved by him. Very, very complex set of circumstances here. And so what I wanted to do with you here on this last part of this case study is show you how we have stepped backwards in the censuses and to try to find Charles as an enslaved person. So here we have the 1880 census in Arlington, and you can see over here on the right, you know, this particular page, you can see this yellow line here. Well, that's the yellow line here, and that's Mariah Syphax. That's Charles's wife. So it shows you where we are in this, but I want you to see all of the Syphaxes that are listed here. And it shows what they were doing. We had one Syphax, John Syphax, who was a justice of the peace. He went on to be elected to be a delegate in the state legislature, House of Delegates. We had another Syphax who was actually, this was a Syphax descendant, even though his last name was Reeves. He would work for the Census Bureau. Isn't that amazing? And then we also see them living right next to the superintendent of the area. So this is 1820. It shows, all of these things. Mariah at this particular time is 1880 is a widow. So Charles has already passed away. So let's back up 10 years. So if we back up 10 years and we do the same thing, we can see Mariah. This is 1870. Charles died in 1869, so he's not going to be shown here. He would have been freed at that time. But you can see all of the Syphaxes and the Syphax grandchildren that are here. And there are many more that live in other places, but this is actually at Arlington where this census is actually taken. So this is 1870. Now, if we go back to 1860, there's a couple of things I want to point out here. You can see, look at, by just looking at this particular page, you can see Mariah, which is what we talked about before, and her children, grandchildren. But look at who we have, just a few lines below. Here's line 9, and then in line 15, we have the Lee family. And then below that, we have the Branham family. So it really puts this family together on this property. But the thing that we can't forget about is this, is that as we go further back, we should really start to think about how we look at this census holistically. So in 1850, we find Mariah here, just like we did before, or somehow they got they were calling these folks Branhams and they were been Syphaxes. So you have to be cautious about the enumerators that are doing this. They're living right next to the Branhams, but these Branhams were not, these folks that were enumerated here were not Branhams, they were Syphaxes. So the census isn't always accurate. But the thing that I want to highlight here is that we also need to recognize that a lot of times information will spill over from page to page. And so the information that we have here on page 21 is down here at the bottom. And you can see we have George Washington Parke Custis and his family and the Branhams. And so if we start to look at this a little more closely, and we think about page 21 and page 22 being put together, now it starts to make a little more sense in terms of the relationships that we see with one another. So as you are studying your census records, you need to be able to basically think about not just what's on that page that you're staring at, but what's on the next page and what's on the previous page to see if there's any connectivity. Now, 1850, Charles is still alive, but he's not listed here because he's enslaved. And so one of the things that we can do here is we can start to look at the 1850 slave census. And so real quickly, as we wind up this part of the case study, I wanted to show you what that looks like. What we have here is the 1850 census slave schedule, and it shows George Washington Parke Custis. And the goal here is to, one of the things that it shows is how many people he owned. This is George Washington Parke Custis on this column, on this column, and on this column. I'll just give you just a second to think about that. All of these people show the people that he owned at Arlington, and there's not a name to be found on this list. All of these people are listed by a sex and by age. So we don't have names there. And so you can see that over here on the right, as we're looking for Charles, we know about when he was born in 1791. And so we can begin to start to look for people that would be similar to this. We can find out how many people that George Washington Parke Custis owned in 1850. He had 93 people that were on the slave schedule that were owned by George Washington Parke Custis. And if we begin to look at and try to tie the pieces together, we can find an enslaved person at 59 years old that's male, that's colored, which is about the same age as Charles Syphax. And so it's likely, very likely, that this particular person on this census, even though a name is not listed, is in fact Charles Syphax. So these are things that you can begin to do using techniques to search for your family members. The last thing that I want to show you here is that in 1863, after George Washington Parke Custis, he died in 1857, he basically freed the people that he had enslaved, but he allowed his daughter and son-in-law to keep them in bondage up to 5 more years in order to pay debts. In 1863, Robert E. Lee signs a manumission document that frees Charles Syphax. So Charles Syphax was freed by his brother-in-law, Robert E. Lee. So these are other things that you can look for. You can try to use manumission documents to help tell the stories of your own families. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to turn it over to Lori. And then I will talk to you again in just a little bit about my last case study.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. Just to reiterate what Steve mentioned in his presentation, it's good to start with what you know, a name, a relative's name, a place, any bit of information that you have to get yourself started. And look at every document. Don't stop at the census records. And don't automatically trust everything that you see online. I think all of us have some experience with following some data that wasn't necessarily accurate. So verify everything. And what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to focus on the records and the information that are available at the Thomas Balch Library, which is the History and Genealogy Library here in Loudoun County, and also records that are available at the Loudoun County Courthouse. But these, I will try to also translate that to what you can look for in your own locale, whether it's at the town level or the county or at the state level, that your location may have some of these same records as well, or these same repositories. So let's start here with this slide with a summary of a checklist of records to look at. And Steve has discussed the census records and deeds and wills. These are some others here. There are freedom seeker ads that might have been compiled for your location. Death records, marriage records, birth records, family papers, the Freedmen Bureau records. And let's see, up at the top, Steve had mentioned funeral records, chancery cases I'll spend some time on later, and judgment papers, the Register of Free Negroes, the other census records that cover agriculture and industry that are also available, and you can access those on ancestry.com, and the military records, as Steve had mentioned in his case study. And so let's look at some of the records that are resources that are available at the Thomas Balch Library. But again, these may translate to repositories that you have near you or where you're researching, either via local history or genealogy. And so one of the best resources here at the Thomas Balch Library, which is where I am today, is the helpful staff. They have knowledge, they know where the records are, and they can help you with your search. There are books, there's microfilms, family papers, photos, magazines, and local research. And there's also a very large document with photographs of an African-American architectural survey report that was done in Loudoun County in 2004. That was a joint venture between the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors and the Black History Committee here at the Thomas Balch Library. And then there are also online subscriptions that you may not want to pay for, but you can at home for home access, but you can come in here and take a look. And so let's first start with books and what we have available here. And let me talk about the books by Pat Duncan. She has abstracted a lot of information from legal documents at the courthouse, also local newspapers. And by abstract, I mean she has taken the relevant text from those documents and put those into either book or CD form or DVD form. And they provide an overview and the information about that particular record. So it's not just an index pointing to a record that you can go to, it's actual helpful information abstracted from those records. And she has done order books from the county, personal property tax records, and the deeds and wills. And they're very helpful in terms of getting started, in terms of finding. She also has a great index in the back of those books, and you can look, for example, with deeds. It's not just the person who bought or sold the land, but she has included every time someone's name is mentioned. And so that comes in handy in terms of putting together a neighborhood. Because you can tell most likely the people who are witnessing a deed record or a will record are probably living in the same location as that person. So it helps in terms of identifying where people are living. And mentioning Pat's book, she has done not just Loudoun County, but records in Fairfax and Clark County, but wherever you live. That would be something for you to look at, either at a repository such as the library, or searching Amazon or a genealogical society or a historical society, looking to see, has somebody done that work in looking through many of the legal documents of the newspapers and abstracted some of that information and made it available to you. Other resources here at the library in book form, the Black History Committee, which is the subcommittee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library, has published several books, including Essence of the People 1 and 2, a great booklet, African American Communities, that has a map and a little bit of information about many of the communities that mostly were established after the Civil War, some of them pre-Civil War, but mostly after. And on microfilm, we're able to look at deeds, wills, land tax records, and this list that I'm showing you here. And these records most of the legal records are available at the courthouse. But if you're not able to get to the courthouse during business hours, these are great resources to be able to use at the library when they're open at night and on weekends, and this information is more accessible. And it can also get you started for when you do go to the courthouse, which at some point you're probably going to have to do when you're doing this kind of research. And then also here at the Balch Library, also it might be available through your public library system, or also a history and genealogy library where you are doing the research. And just a few of them, the ones that I use most frequently, Ancestry.com, Fold 3, which contains military records, newspaper databases like newspapers.com, very helpful. And JSTOR, African American Heritage, the ProQuest, and AfroGenius. And free access through the library. So if you go to the Thomas Balch Library website, there are several databases that you can look at for free from home. There are freedom seeker ads that were extracted from the Genius of Liberty newspaper, and the transcriptions, as well as the actual newspaper, what they look like in the newspaper, are available online. There's a cemetery database, and of course there's also Find a Grave to use, but the cemetery database here contains, I have found some more information, because someone hasn't been out to a cemetery to document it for Find a Grave, but I found it here at the Balch Library Cemetery Database. An index to oral histories that are available here at the library, an index to the Loudoun County newspapers, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the African American Architectural Survey. Now let me talk about some of the legal records and the resources that are available at our Loudoun County Courthouse and might be available at your courthouse. We are very fortunate here in Loudoun County to have our records back to 1757 when the county was formed. Our records were not burned during the Civil War. The justices ordered the clerk of the circuit court to transport those records out of Loudoun County for safekeeping, and they were stored throughout the war in southwestern Virginia and then ordered to be brought back after the war. So as I said, we're very fortunate to have these records. We're also very fortunate to have a clerk of the circuit court who supports conserving these records and making them available to the public. And full confession, I work in the historic records room at the courthouse, and we have a staff of 3 people in that department. And while we do modern day records as well, we do work very closely and help people with their research for these legal records at the courthouse. And so some of the records that are here, the most often used for genealogical research, deeds, wills, and estate accounts, and I cannot emphasize enough, don't just stop at reading somebody's will. There are records associated with wills that are called fiduciary records. Those are things like inventories, appraisals, and accounting of that person's estate. And so you will find those available at the Loudoun County Courthouse as well. The certificates of freedom and the Register of Free Negroes here in Loudoun. There are enslaved papers. And I should stop here and mention that what we've done here in Loudoun is anything related to free Blacks or enslaved people were pulled out of other records. For example, out of judgments, which are sort of like a small claims course. And they have been indexed, and the free Black papers are now online at the Loudoun County Courthouse. You can look at both the indexes and you can look at the actual records themselves. And there is work being done on the papers that relate to enslaved people. And these are rich resources. And with the wills, it's not just mentioning enslaved people in someone's will, but also with the inventories that were done and appraisals that were done, there may be mention of the people you are researching in those documents as well. Chancery cases, I'll get to those in a minute, but they are available. All Loudoun County's chancery records up until I think 1912 are available at the Library of Virginia. They're online. You can sit at home and look through those at the actual records. Road cases here in Loudoun County in Virginia, and perhaps in your state as well, were petitions from citizens to the county court to either put in a new road or expand a road. And you might find mention of people that you were researching in those cases. And judgments, as I just mentioned, sort of like a small claims taken care of at the local level, not going before a jury. And then criminal cases. I just, in a research project, found a reference to, I was researching a family. It was a white family, but I was trying to find out more about the people that they enslaved. And quite frankly, by happenstance, and because I do work in this department, going through and preparing these cases to go out to be scanned, found a reference to this family and the 2 people that they enslaved. So perhaps not a primary, the main record group that you would go to when you're starting out, but don't overlook as you go through the main records, some of these other records that are available too. And this is a snapshot of our website here in Loudoun County in the historic records room at the courthouse. And you can see on the left-hand side are the different records that you can go to for your search. And then I just clicked on the papers related to Black history, and you can see how these have been broken out into indexes. And then down towards the bottom, the free Black papers, as I mentioned, it's not just the indexes to the records. So the indexes get you started when you either submit a research request or you do come in person to look. But with the free Black papers, those have been digitized and are available online. And here's an example of one of the indexes that we have out of the will packets for under papers related to the enslaved. And I'm going to do it. One of my case studies is about the people that George Carter enslaved. And so before I get to that one, let me just reiterate about the courthouses and in your county. What you will need to do is where you are researching. Check their website, and because every state does things differently. For example, we have the deeds and wills in the historic records room in Loudoun, but in Pennsylvania and some other places, there's a registrar of wills, registrar of deeds, and so forth. So you need to become familiar with how the county legal system and those legal records have been organized, both historically and in the present. And so I would start with looking at the circuit court or district court records, but for your courthouse. And then at the state level, how are things organized? For example, we have access to marriage and death records. Marriage records at the courthouse, but you have to go to, if you're actually looking for copies of things, the Vital Records Department for death records and birth records in Richmond. And so looking at your by state, what records are available and how did they organize them? For example, here in Virginia, we have our records at the county courthouses, but in Maryland, those legal documents, or most of those legal documents, have been sent to the state level and are in Annapolis at the Capitol. So you need to do some research as to the repositories and how they do organize things and how they are made available. So let me go to my first case study here, which is the will. And I'm going to talk about two case studies, one going forward and one going backwards. And the reason that I am using one going forward is that this research was done when I worked at a local historic site. And our research strategy was we wanted to learn about the people who had been enslaved at this place, and then try to learn who were their descendants and to locate descendants who were still living and see if we could connect them. And so my first starting place was with the will that George Carter, who owned the plantation, it was the largest plantation in Loudoun County, looking at his will. And of course, we have that at the courthouse. And it was written in 1842. So another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at wills, they can be written in one year and probated, which means submitted to the court for them to do something about it after the person has died. Could have been probated many, many, many years later. So you need to keep that in mind. Now, in George Carter's case, he wrote it in 42, died in 46. So that time period wasn't very long. But I'm working on a project now where the will was written about 15 years before the person died. So anyone that they're mentioning in that will, or anything they're mentioning in that will, might have changed over those years. And George Carter's will, as I mentioned, he owned the largest plantation here in Loudoun County. And his will very specifically names enslaved people who were to be inherited by his wife and his children. And I've extracted a few of the names here, but one I want to point out is Joe Rust, his wife, and his children. Most of the enslaved people listed in George Carter's will were by first name only, and that is not unusual. What is unusual is the fact that he did name 3 people by their last name. And that, of course, comes in handy in going to the 1870 census, as Steve said, the first time that newly freed people were listed for the first time and with their last names. And here is another example. He in here and references Alanda and Gerard Day. And he's not only mentioning them by last name, but it's very clear that they are married. And in his actual will, if you have the ability, as with any genealogy, to look at the original record and not a transcript of it. So what is recorded in our will books in Loudoun County, and probably where you live too, is the clerk of court at that time went through and transcribed George Carter's will into the will book. And so while he was accurate, what was lost when I actually looked at George Carter's original will is that George Carter didn't just run the names across the page. He sort of had them grouped together. And that was helpful because it helped to prove later with Emmanuel and Julius Day that they were also they were day family members. And so that would have been much clearer had I looked at the original will first. But we're keeping these names in mind: Emmanuel, Julius, and Alanda and Gerard Day. So with these names, and I don't really have, well, actually, at that place where I used to work, that George Carter's wife kept a diary from 1860 through 1872. So it's not always that there's that kind of a record available. But in this case, she wrote about enslaved people constantly in that diary. So that was also very helpful in the research. But I'm not going to focus on that because most of the times we don't have a document like that or a record to go on. So going to the 1870 census, if you remember Gerard Day, here he is recorded in the census, and he is in the household of George and Catherine Carter. George and Catherine Carter are the son and daughter-in-law of George Carter, and they had inherited the plantation. They got married, I think it was 1862 or 3. And so they were living at the plantation after the war. And Gerard Day, 60 years old, is in the household. And you can see that there are other newly freed people living in this household as well. Heba Fisher, Wesley Nelson. And while these were not names that were recorded in or listed in George Carter's will, these were people who were referenced in that diary. So it is helping, to pull together some of that verification of people who had been enslaved at this very large plantation. And as Steve pointed out in his discussion about the census records, we can very clearly see that they are probably living in the household of George and Catherine Carter. Other records, I'm not going to show the rest of the census record because it's long, but other formerly enslaved people are still living on the plantation, but not probably in the Carter household. And so someone you can see, Heba Fisher is a nurse. She's caring, she's young. She is probably caring for George and Catherine Carter's children. And we see that Elizabeth Gregg is a cook. But there's no record of Alanda Day, and I have never found her in another record, and so I presume that she has passed away by that time, because it is about 30 some years from the first time that when George Carter wrote his will. So here again, going to the 1870 census, I had a lot of first names to work with from that 1842 will, and here is Emmanuel Day, living very close to George and Catherine Carter. And for the first time, Emmanuel Day is listed with his wife and his children in that census record. And as we've been able to piece together, he was the son of a man named Julius Day. Now, how Julius Day and Gerard Day are related has not been determined. They were probably brothers, but Julius Day, we have showing over here on the right-hand side in the red font. Julius Day is age 90. His wife Ginny, or Virginia, is 86. They are the father and mother of Emmanuel Day. And the Day family descendants here in Loudoun County and throughout, actually internationally, they're Day family descendants who live in England, but can trace their ancestors back to somewhere 1790, 1810 timeframe for Julius Day, based on what we've been able to find in the census records. And here's another record now going forward from the 1900 census. Virginia Day, she had been the wife of Emmanuel Day, and in her household, living with her son Emmanuel, another son named Julius, and then her daughter-in-law and granddaughters. And so we've been able to take that line of the Day family forward. So let me pause here and switch from the census records and talk about chancery records. And what a chancery record is it's a case of equity. And you often see them in terms of trying to address land disputes, even into the modern day. I think it was in the 1980s, they stopped calling them chancery cases, but through divorces, business disputes, and things like that. They were decided by special commissioners and a judge or a justice. It's not a jury trial, but they can be full of genealogical information. And in Virginia, chancery records go back as far as the founding of the Commonwealth. And as I said, in Loudoun County's case, and for most of the counties in Virginia, they have been digitized up until about 1912, and they're available at the Library of Virginia website. And so let me show you an example, again, still using the Day family. So this is after the period of slavery has ended. This is, I think, from about the 1900s, but after slavery had ended, by that large plantation that I was just talking about with George Carter, several of the newly freed men purchased land in the mid-1870s nearby. They did not purchase from the Carters. They purchased from a man named John Elgin. And I was able to see them in the land tax records. They're in the census records. I can see them living in this newly created little community, predominantly African-American, called Bleedsville, but I couldn't find their deeds. And it was quite a puzzle until I started to look at John Elgin's chancery cases. So as Steve mentioned, you do have to broaden your research beyond the specific person you're researching to look to see what other records might be available for people in the neighborhood or other people mentioned with them. And so I knew from the geography of that, where that village was, that it had been owned by John Elgin. So I started looking through his chancery records, and lo and behold, here is this chancery case. John Elgin's estate versus Alexander Lucas and others. And what Alexander and others, including Day family members and other men like Basil Turner, whose name is mentioned here, who had been enslaved at Oatlands, they had purchased land from John Elgin. That was the creation of the community called Bleedsville. And it was not uncommon for a deed to not be recorded at the courthouse. So a deed is created, you sell the land, but it needs to be recorded at the courthouse. And that had not been done. And so this is a chancery case asking for those deeds to be created and recorded. And so finally, I was able to find those deeds and the actual proof of those deeds here in this chancery case. But look what else I found. This is really a nice piece of information that many of the chancery cases have, and that's what's called a plat. And so it's not an individual survey of a specific property, but it's a look, a little map, a snapshot of a neighborhood. And this was in one of the chancery cases that I found. And so here are people that I had been researching. At the top, you'll see Robert Day. He was the son of Emmanuel. Down at the bottom and upside down, but Thomas Day. You'll see where they were located on the road, and you can see on the right-hand side a reference to one of the Day family members' house, and then below it a little drawing of Alexander Lucas's house. And so this is a great piece of information to have because it shows a little bit of how that village was laid out. Another source here at the library to look at is, I got this from Newspapers on Microfilm here at the county. I think it was newspapers. No, it was our local newspaper, the Loudoun Times-Mirror. But it's the obituary. I just mentioned the little town, the little village of Bleedsville. It was about Sandy Johnson, who was killed in action right before his birthday. He was a soldier during World War II. And so it was more information about the Johnson family that I didn't have, but I was able to find through the newspaper records here at the Thomas Balch Library. So now I want us to do my second case study, which is the Bessard family. and working with a friend on this who was researching her Bassard family and working backwards. And so we started with what she knew. She knew her, obviously, we started with her parents' name, her grandparents' name, and she knew that her grandfather and her had moved to Washington, D.C. at some point. And that, of course, descendants still lived in the area, but we were starting with what we knew, which was the present day, and going backwards. And so we started going back through the census records, looking for the man named associated with Frank Bassard. And we found in the 1920 census, here is Frank down here at the bottom. And she wasn't sure Frank's father's name, but what we found here in the census records is we were able to identify Frank's father's name and his wife's name, and then other family members. And from here, we started going, and we also found, she knew that they lived in South Carolina, and they were in Sumter County or in that area, but we got a more precise location through the census records with Concord Township. So again, as I mentioned, you need to find out what records are available and are not available in the place where you're researching. And there had been a fire in South Carolina at this particular place. And so some of these records are not going to be available at the county. But this is some information from the county courthouse about what their vital records and the status of them. So going back to the census, we're going back in time, and again, another census record for Jack Bassard and more information about the family. And we're going back again, and in this previous, and on this census record, we actually get more information about Sarah's mother. We have her mother living in the household with Jack Bassard, but we also have, look who's down a little further down here. There are additional Bassards in this area, and we're getting more names to work with as we do this research to try to locate and learn more about the family. And here we are in 1870, where we were able to take it back. So here is Jack Bassard, but we're finding his father's name as well, and Cyrus Bassard. And the previous slide we saw Charlotte. Now we see that as of the census before that one, her connection to Cyrus. And so we're going back, continuously going back as far as we can, until we hit, of course, that 1870 challenge of how can we locate them during the time of slavery and prior to when their freedom came. And in researching in that area and wondering whether Bassard came from the people who might have enslaved them, we do find there is a Charlotte Bassard, her son John, and another son Joseph. And so we began to research the white Bassards and finding out more about them. And we learn about this man who was born in 1825, and he moved to Sumterville in Sumter County. But as we continue to research the white Bassard family, we find that they also own a property in Georgetown County. And so we now learned for the first time, while we need to focus on Sumter County, we also have records to look at in Georgetown County as well, also in South Carolina, because they likely, when they were had moved from Georgetown, I think in eastern South Carolina, moved from there to Sumterville, taken enslaved people with them, or they had 2 plantations. And so there were 2 places to look. And so here we see how far away Georgetown is, Georgetown on the coast to Sumter. And so here's a good point to reference that knowing the locations of places is also very important in terms of this gives you different places to know where to research, what is available in those places, but also the ancestors or the people that you're researching, what is going on in those places during those time periods. Now we're back to the 1850 slave schedule. And as Steve pointed out, enslaved people were rarely, I've seen a couple instances, I believe in Fauquier County, which is adjacent to Loudoun, where there were a few enslaved people mentioned by name, but that is rare. It is typically by sex and by age, and sometimes you will see Black and mulatto in here in the schedule. And so in 1850, most of the people enslaved by the Bassard family were with Joseph S. Bassard. But as we go forward and look at the 1860 slave schedule, most are now enslaved. Joseph Bassard has enslaved, according to the slave schedule, no one. But the number of people enslaved by his mother, Charlotte, has gone up significantly. And so we believe that she either purchased enslaved people from her son, or they were they're living and working and laboring on wherever it is that she lives at this time. But one thing about the 1860 slave schedule that's also interesting, especially if you're researching properties, is the number of slave dwellings is enumerated in that census. And we see that there were 4 slave houses on that property. So if you ever do find the location, the actual place where someone had been enslaved, the person you're researching, this is a bit of information that may be of interest to you in terms of, are there any buildings still in existence on that property? But look at also in this, it lists a number of enslaved people who are classified as fugitive from the state, meaning they left to seek their freedom. And that is quite a large number. We frankly don't know what to make of it in terms of our research with this particular family. There may have been Bassard family members who had been enslaved and who left and sought their freedom during that time period. So this is 1860, just, all the rumblings of what became the Civil War. And so perhaps people were leaving because of this concern about what was going to happen. We don't know. But what it would indicate as we're doing the research is to look far and wide, not just in Washington, D.C. or in South Carolina, for people who may have left South Carolina to seek their freedom. And we discovered a widow's pension application in Fold 3. As Steve mentioned, these military records can be so helpful. Now, this is for Penelope Bassard, the widow of William. We're not exactly sure how William is connected to Cyrus and Jack Bassard, but it's one more clue in what will probably be a long time in the research. Let me just go, before I leave this case study, when we first started looking at the records, the deeds were not available online in Sumter County, South Carolina, but there is a way to now sign up to be able to access certain records at the Sumter Courthouse. So that's another thing to point out, is that you constantly have to go back and look at things again and look at sites again and repositories to see what else has become available. And so that's why it's very critical to keep a research log of what you've done. So not only do you know what you've already done, but that you can go back and do a double check, as we did here. Steve had mentioned, so now I'm just switching to some other records for you to look at. And in Virginia, cohabitation registers were supposed to be kept. Each county was supposed to create a record, as per the Freedmen's Bureau, of people, of formerly enslaved people who had been married or considered themselves to be married. We have absolutely no record of one existing in Loudoun County, but there are cohabitation registers in other Virginia counties, and many of them are available on the Library of Virginia's website. And this is an example of the Augusta County Register. And I don't have an exact, I don't have something, I've looked through every county register because, as you will see over here, for the birthplaces and the residences, and I see Mount Vernon, Virginia here, that it might say there might be people from Loudoun County or Leesburg or Middleburg. So you have to also search not just by county name, but some of the predominant towns in your county or wherever you're researching. Some other records to look at. So I've already talked about Loudoun.gov and our records. Ancestry, Fold 3, Find a Grave can be very, very helpful. But again, I have found information there where some family connections have been listed that aren't necessarily accurate. So you just have to double check everything. And here's the website for Library of Virginia, where you can find online chancery records, the cohabitation records. And some others here locally, the Afro-American Historical Association in Fauquier County is a great resource. And some others that, this one in particular, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery. It's one I keep going back to and looking, and I'll show you an example here in a minute of one that I found to be actually helpful in two projects of mine. And then Facebook history and genealogy groups. Search for those where you're doing your research. We have two really good ones here in Northern Virginia. There's one for Loudoun, one for Northern Virginia. And Pat Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the founders of one of those genealogy groups. They're very helpful, and people are very, very helpful in terms of providing information. So the website I just mentioned, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery. And then the top one is, I was referencing Gleedsville, and this little community here in Loudoun County founded after freedom came by a man named Jack Lead. And lo and behold, in this database from Last Seen is someone looking for, the mother is looking for Lucy Gleed, her daughter. She mentions the widow Carter from, that's spelled Oakland, and that was Oatlands. But it gave us confirmation of Lucy Gleed and the connection to her daughter. But also she's living, she's staying at, and I don't find her there in all the census records, but she's staying at Daniel Russ's house on O Street in Washington, D.C. The Russes were, if you remember way back to my slide about George Carter and his will, Joe Rust was named by surname in that will. Daniel is a descendant of Joe Rust. And so here in Loudoun, it's sometimes spelled Russ with an S, sometimes with a T, but I don't have a family connection between the Gleeds and the Russ, but definitely a broader kin connection there. And then the bottom information wanted is about a family I've been researching in Loudoun County, the Berrymans. And look at this bit of genealogical information in here and how much that has given. And I'm still researching that one. That's a work in progress, but it has given confirmation to some of those family names. And now I am going to turn it back over to Steve for his discussion about his DNA research. Thank you.
I was on mute there. I couldn't get back. Thanks, Lori. That was great. There you go. You stop sharing your screen. I'll share mine. And as we're getting ready to talk about this, the really fun and neat thing about the work that Lori and I have found ourselves doing, we find our work crisscrossing. There are places where we intersect all the time. You know, I had mentioned that Mariah Carter-Syphax, married Charles Syphax, and you think of that middle name Carter. You know, she was talking about Carters. You know, there are aspects here that there's a lot to look at, but we don't necessarily know where the answers are, but we know that there are pieces hidden in there. So it's fascinating. And so this is one of the reasons why buddying up and using resources of other people are really, really important. So what I want to do now is share with you relatively quickly the work that I have been doing on a DNA study. And I'll give you a little bit of background about DNA, a quick primer. And I would ask you to listen to this case study as a way of getting familiar with concepts. There's going to probably be some technical aspects of this that are a little bit difficult to understand. I'll say that up front. So if you're able to watch it a second time, it may sink in. But there are aspects of this that it takes a little bit of work to learn how to do and how to put some pieces together. So I share with that with you up front, so you don't get overwhelmed with what I want you to take away from this. And what I want you to take away from it is that based on what it is that we've been trying to learn, we have come a long way and we've been able to answer some questions here. And that's really the important piece to me in terms of using DNA and genealogy research. So I want to start this case study by, first of all, sharing with you my family tree. This is the Syphax family tree 2.0. We just finished putting this together, two cousins and I, last fall. And we basically created the colors here so you could more distinctly see the various branches of the tree. That blue branch in the middle are all people who are descendants of Charles and Mariah Syphax, who are descendants of Martha Washington. So it's a really a big branch there. And then over on the left-hand side is Nancy Syphax, who's Charles' sister, and that's the branch that I'm associated with. And if you can see the star there down in the lower right portion of the yellow area, that's where I sit on this tree. And the other thing that I want you to take away from this tree is you can see all of the dots, all of the blue dots and all the pink dots. Those are all the people in the Syphax family that I have asked to, as I've been trying to get people to take DNA tests. These are all the people that have taken tests. The pink is for females, blue is for males. So you can see we're up near around 50 people who have actually taken DNA tests, which creates a tremendous database for what we're looking at as we're thinking about how this all fits together. If you're familiar with DNA, you know that how things are being sold on TV, tell you about how you can, find your cousins and what your ethnicity and things are. Well, here is real quickly, kind of a summary of what you can get from Ancestry. And so I want to just kind of, here's where you can kind of start. You can think about ethnicity and you can think about DNA comparisons, but you should take all of this with a grain of salt. You've seen the commercial about the guy that's wearing lederhosen and he turns it in for a quilt or vice versa. These results are based on base populations that these testing organizations use to compare us to. So depending on who you use, whether it's Ancestry or Family Tree DNA or 23andMe, your ethnicity is going to be a little bit different. And so I point out this to you so you can see my ethnicity is, a lot of African, probably 52% in terms of African ethnicity, and I think it's 48%, 47% of kind of European. And what this tells me is what you can see here is the fact that this is basically European men and African women who have come together to create Steve in the 2000s, which is really pretty amazing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the kinds of tables that you get from an Ancestry, which actually shows you who you match and how much DNA you share with one another. And you can see at the top, that shows my daughters, and you can see how much DNA we share, and then you can see my brother, and then you can see some close family members. And the further people get away from, being immediate relatives, the smaller amount of DNA you share with one another. So real quickly, there are 4 types of DNA. And so there's mitochondrial DNA, which actually is passed down from mother to child. And so it's passed down from a mom to both her son and her daughter. But mitochondrial DNA cannot be passed down by a son. He can receive it from his mother, but he cannot pass it on. So from mitochondrial DNA, we can learn a lot about that maternal line that you see over here on the right. So we can go way, way, way back in history in terms of trying to better understand where the line of the women's line, the maternal line, actually kind of originates. The Y DNA, which is a sex determining chromosome, is a male chromosome, and that is passed down from father to son. Women do not have a Y chromosome, but men do. And so over here on the left, you can see all the, the Y is passed down to son, to son, to son, to son. There is also two other types of DNA. There's autosomal DNA, which is passed down from all of our ancestors. So if this is Steve right here, I get half of my autosomal DNA from my father and half of my autosomal DNA from my mother. And they in turn get half of their DNA from their mother and father. So by the time it gets to me, I'm getting a little bitty pieces from all of these folks. And the DNA that I actually have a brother, I don't have a sister, but the DNA that two siblings get from their parents is not the same. It's random in terms of how that DNA is passed from parent to child. So unless you're identical twins, you're not going to have identical DNA. The other DNA is DNA that's passed. It's the X DNA. So the female passes an X to the daughter, and the father passes an X DNA to the daughter. So the X chromosome, the Y chromosome are sex determining chromosomes. So if it's a girl, the father has passed his X on to his daughter. So women have two X chromosomes, one from the mother, one from the father. The males have an X chromosome that's passed from the mother and a Y chromosome that's passed to the father. So I tell you this because these types of DNA can help us answer questions. Let's see if I'll try to get this to change for me here. There we go. So I tell you this because depending on the type of DNA we use, it may help us to answer questions. And so I'm going to show you a couple of types of DNA here in this case study that shows you what we can learn about a couple of things. So one of the things I wanted to show you here is, as I compare myself to one of my cousins, this is my DNA, but my study buddy. So, we were talking about earlier, rafting up and finding a study buddy. Well, Donna Gleed-Kunkel is my study buddy, and we share DNA. She's my second cousin. We know exactly how we are related. And you may have seen in the previous slide the amount of DNA that we share. With the amount that I share with my brother is over 2,000 what's called a centimorgans. What I share with my cousin is about 250 centimorgans over about 14 segments, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But I want you to imagine for just a second what this DNA thread looks like. Think of it as a spool of thread, okay? We're looking over here on the right, this spool of thread, and we each have 7,000 centimorgans. Just think of a centimorgan, just for the purposes of this conversation, the centimorgan being an inch, okay? So we each have 7,000 inches of DNA that make up our bodies, ourselves. We get 3,500 of those inches from our dad, 350 of those from our mother. And then as we go further back, we have less from each one of our ancestors. So what Donna and I share are 254 of these inches of DNA. And I'm going to go back to centimorgans now. We share 254 centimorgans, but it's over several lengths of DNA. And so here, if we were to plot this, put this into a graph of how much DNA Donna and I share and where we share that in our genome, this is what the picture looks like. So Donna and I share this 254 centimorgans over 14 of the 23 chromosomes that we each have. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but the first 22 chromosomes are autosomal DNA chromosomes, and the last chromosome is an X chromosome. So you can see that Dawn and I share a lot of X DNA. So we have a lot that's been passed down through our female line that we share. So as you're thinking about DNA, you know, people just say, hey, maybe I'll just take a DNA test and just see what I can find and that kind of thing, is that you really do need to start with a question. It goes right back to what Lori and I were talking about at the beginning of our other presentations is, you know, start with a question in mind so you know that you're not just doing it to do it. So, you know, I'm interested in you know, where the maternal ancestors were from. You know, I'm interested in who my genetic relatives are. You know, can I locate a birth parent or a child for somebody who is adopted or orphaned? Perhaps you can find the parent or a family members that might be, you know, of interest to you. And can I identify a common ancestor with another test taker? And so I'm going to show you today how I've been able to do some of these things. And so here's a little bit bigger blow up of that family tree. This is just for the Nancy-Syphax side, and it's even a smaller case of that because it's just those people who have tested. You see here these ones that are filled in gold. These are all people on my family tree who have actually tested. So here's Steve right here. He's number 1. And here's my cousin Donna. She's number 2. And all of these other people have tested. This is a person who is, we want him to test. I have it there to highlight as this is my roadmap in terms of where we are. I want him to test, but he hasn't tested yet. But you can see here, I have also this connotation of mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA. And the goal for me here is to try to determine where the mitochondrial DNA comes from to see if I can answer a question. And so if you look at myself, you can see I get my mitochondrial DNA from my mother, from my grandmother, from my great-grandmother, and this is a person of interest that we're going to talk about today. And if you look at these others, like my brother, he's going to have the same mitochondrial DNA as I do. We have a cousin over here who his mother gave him mitochondrial DNA, his grandmother gave him mitochondrial DNA, and she also is, his great-grandmother is also Cora Joseph. And finally, we have another cousin over here who it follows the same pattern. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you today about Cora Joseph. I want to tell you, I just love talking about this. And so it's I think it's pretty amazing. And so I want to just give you just a little more context. Remember, we talked about, you know, the 6 generations here. Well, here's Cora on my tree. She is right here. And you can see this is right after 1870. She was born in 1842. But we know very little about her parents and what her life may have been like. And I'll tell you why that here in just a second. And so once again, setting context, here is my great-grandmother, Cora Joseph. Her father's name was Baker, but she went by Lane, the name Lane, and we've seen it spelled a couple of different ways. And then she married a Peter Joseph. And so you're going to see these names in a couple of different ways as we proceed here. But this is who we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. And so again, how we are related is through my mother's line. And here's Cora down here, and I'm interested in trying to determine who her mother was and who her ancestors were beyond that. So as I've been looking for matches on various platforms, my cousin Don and I came across this match that just stood out to us because it wasn't one that we had seen before. And so I began to look at this match. And to make a long story short, this match we're going to call, her name is Marilee. So you're going to see this ME1 or Marilee. It is clear that Marilee and I are connected somehow. We share quite a bit of DNA. We share, here it shows you, we share about 35 centimorgans of DNA, with the largest segment being about 23. And I determined that we are probably 3rd or 4th cousins. So this is my hypothesis over here on the left. It kind of shows how we're connected. And so I'm looking for a common ancestor here, trying to see how this piece fits together. And one of the things that I have begun to do is I've begun to build a family tree for Marilee. And we know she's here. She's been married twice. And here we kind of have a sense of what her family tree looks like. And we know of a couple of other people who have actually tested. So just a little bit more about Cora Lane. Cora, as I said, was born in 1842. And as you can see here, she was motherless about age 6. And so we have very little information about her parentage. Now, we believe her parents basically died of yellow fever or smallpox. There are a number of studies that have been done that show the number of we think about COVID here, but during this period, the number of epidemic that occurred and the number of deaths that occurred in New Orleans and the South as a result of repeated epidemics is huge. And in 1853, remember I said that she was born in 1847, 1853, she was 6. The largest epidemic of yellow fever that occurred, recorded in New Orleans, that was 1853. So both of her parents likely succumbed to disease. And we're able to discern this from, her, we talked about the using obituaries. So here we have an obituary and you can see how in such poor shape that it is. But what we're able to determine from that is here it says about age 8. So, we're within 1853, 1855 in terms of when she became orphaned and trying to learn more about her family. Basically said she was taken in by a woman who had a lot of children, but other than that, we don't know much. So the first thing that I wanted to do is recognizing that I have mitochondrial DNA from Cora Lane is to look at my mitochondrial DNA as well as the mitochondrial DNA of those other 3 people I just showed you. And so what I have done here is I've built kind of a tree that shows you the females who connect to Cora Lane that kind of show you how our mitochondrial DNA are passed to us. So it's passed from mother to offspring. And so from this, we can tell, we know what Cora's mitochondrial DNA is, but what it tells us is, and here's what's the power about this is that we know that she got mitochondrial DNA from her mother and her grandmother and on back. And by learning what that is, we can start to make some inferences about where her family was from. And as you can see here, I don't want you to read this slide in its entirety, but what has been done as scientists as they have broken this down is they have come up with this family tree that shows where these ancestors have come from. And if we look at the DNA that Cora has passed to us, she has received it. Her distant ancestors were from Africa. We know that they were probably from West Central Africa. And so that suggests to me that she, in fact, somebody was brought on a ship and brought to either the Caribbean first and probably on to the South, whether it be Mississippi or New Orleans or something at some period of time. So this allows us to have a sense for this particular line. The female line came from Africa. Okay, here we go. Work with me here. There we go. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do is start thinking about the autosomal DNA, the DNA that's passed down from everybody. So here we are looking at what I'm going to call a cluster chart. You're going to see several of these over the next few slides, but here, whoops, I don't want to do that yet. We're going to back up. What I want to show you is that as I've been working with Marilee and her family, several people have in fact taken DNA tests. And we're beginning to compare notes in terms of how much DNA we share with one another. And you can see here, all these that are in blue are Marilee's direct family members, immediate family members. You can see how much they share. This is mother, daughter, mother, granddaughter, mother, grandson, that kind of thing. And over here on the left is the amount of DNA that I share and Donna share with each of those family members. And you can see that it's a lot less, but we share DNA with almost all of them. It's really pretty amazing. And so that tells us that there is definitely a connection. Somewhere we have a common ancestor. And so without having your eyes glaze over, I won't spend much time on this slide. I basically wanted to try to put together a tree that would allow us to begin to figure out who the common ancestor was. And I did that by building Marilee's tree. Here's Marilee with the arrow here. Here's Steve over here on this side. So I'm building trees both sides of this thing, and I'm trying to figure out who is the person. So the fact that we know that Cora Joseph's mother was from Africa tells me that her father was likely a European, somebody that was not African descent. So that kind of, gives us the hint that it was a male who has contributed that part of the DNA. So we built this tree. And so as a result of that, we then begin to start looking at these clusters in more detail. Up here in the upper left are a subset of all of my cousins on the Joseph-Syphax side of the family. You may recall that we had 50 people that have participated in this already. Basically, we're taking about 10 people here who I know have, some DNA that they share with Marilee and her family. Then we have this second, I did that again, sorry. We have this second, I want to go back, here we go. We have this second cluster right here, and here is Marilee's family, her immediate family. The thing that I want to point out to you is Marilee shares DNA with all of us, and then there are other people in her family that also share with us, which is really pretty amazing. So the goal for me is to continue to build out this tree. So I'm trying to figure out, how these pieces are connected and who possibly our Cora Joseph could be related to. So I know this is very busy and complex, but the point that I want to make here is that we have people here in the green circles who have done tests on Marilee's side. And we have people here that are distant cousins of Marilee's, or second, third cousins here. And we have a couple of folks here that we don't know how they're connected, but they share DNA. And so we're trying to put these pieces together. And so once we do that, we can actually begin to look at who the common ancestors are by taking this and finding out who were the men that were born around the right time that could be a parent of Cora. We can start to make our really big haystack smaller. And so what we've begun to do is we've begun to build this data set that allows us to see, could they, based on their age and location, are they direct ancestors to Marilee, and could they have been Cora's father? And where were they when they were born? Where were they, what was their birth location? Where were they in 1847 when Cora was born? I think I said if she was born in 1842, but she was born in 1847. And then, when did they die? So were they around, and were they alive? Are they really possibly, people that we should be thinking about? And so we have begun to take this database and look at where all these people were located at. And it's very complex, but we're able, as a result of all this, to begin to look at what DNA we share and where on our genome that DNA is shared with. So this is Marilee compared to all of the, my cousins and others that are a part of this. And you can see we're sharing DNA in exactly the same places. Not all of the same places. There are other places that they share, but these are kind of the hot spots. And so here is what it looks like when we look at all the cousins together. I mean, it's a rainbow of people sharing DNA with one another. And we're able to look at this and begin to pull things out and tell a story that allows us to answer questions here. So let's see here. Let's see if. So I'll back up here and just simply say, as a result of doing this today, I wanted to leave you with the fact that using DNA to solve these problems is becoming a really interesting and yet challenging way to look at your family history. And there are reasons to do it. And some people feel like DNA is not what they want to do, but I would challenge you that if you're interested in doing this, you should decide what it is that you want to research, and then build the skill sets that allow you to use this technology in a way that would be of most help to you. I've got several resources here that I think might be helpful in terms of the stuff that we've talked about today. Some of this is very recent, some of it is a little bit older, but I think that it's all very valuable. And then here are some resources online. You know, some of them are similar to what Lori was sharing with you, but I think that all of these might be valuable as you think about how you really get started on your search for your family ancestors. So with that, I will stop sharing. And I think we can ask Laura to help us answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Steve and Lori. I think these have been really great presentations with some really, really excellent examples of many of the tools that are out there. And I know we have some good questions, and I'm gonna change the view here. And while I'm doing that, I hope people will add a few more into the Q&A box and the chat box. So if you have questions, please go ahead and send them on to us. I'm gonna switch the views so hopefully we can see both of you at once. Bear with me 1 second here. Go. Sorry. There we go.
I've put my contact information into the chat box if people want to follow up afterwards. Maybe Lori, if you're interested in doing that, you can do the same for folks.
Excellent. And I'm happy to also include both of your contact information in an email that will go out after the class, which will also include the video link. So a few questions from the very beginning of Steve's program. One was, do both of you have any recommendations for finding manumission records? Any helpful hints or suggestions for locating those?
Well, you know what? I mean, manumission records in some ways are like the needle in the haystack, but it really means you have to go into the records. This is not something, manumission records are not necessarily something that you're going to find online. It's going to require, now that places are starting to open up again, you're going to have to go into courthouses and begin to look at what they've got there physically. There are some places that may have indexes that can tell you what they have. You know, but it really, for me, when I found the manumission documents for the Syphaxes, I was going roll by roll to find out the information. But the clue that I had was, remember that Dorothy Provine book that showed the free Negro registers? She had done a lot of the work that basically said where to find those documents. So that's what I would say, Lori.
And I have seen them in deeds of emancipation, which were not legally required to be recorded at the courthouse. Sometimes those manumissions were, you know, just done, but some I've seen them in deeds. I've seen just recently for another project where someone in his will said that he wanted to emancipate the people he enslaved, and then I went right to the Register of Free Negroes and found that indeed the executor of his estate proved their freedom, and it was recorded there. So, you know, wills, deeds, some perhaps in some chancery cases, but as Steve just said, you're really going to have to go through and dig through the records.
Another question we got during Steve's first presentation that's related to records. Someone was interested with the Negro registries, and particularly they were interested if you knew if there were any similar ones in Alabama and Texas. And I guess maybe a broader question that's very specific, and I know it would be helpful to that person because they say they hit a wall in those states in 1858. Do you have any recommendations in addition to the resources you both provided us for locating, there you go, resources in other states? Excellent.
So this is a book that I would recommend that you consider putting in your library. I haven't used it much in the last few months, but as I was a beginning genealogist, this was a tremendous resource because what it does is it goes state by state and talks about the resources that they have. It talks about when counties were formed, when counties were split apart, and it has a lot of information about what kind of records are available. So the handy book for genealogists is a really powerful tool. And there may be others out there, Lori, that you can point people to now, but this is a standard that a lot of people have used to help kind of at least start the search.
And I would just add, contact your courthouse and ask them that very specific question, because that was a legal document. And
Right.
so, ask those specific questions of someone at your courthouse.
Yeah.
And again, be prepared, for example, Texas, those documents, a certain document might have been required in the state, but whether they survived the war, fires that were very common, that's another brick wall you may hit.
Absolutely. I'll add to that is that I'm doing some work down in King William County, and it is, it's a burned county. So as a result of the Civil War and fires in courthouses, a lot of those records that were so precious just don't exist anymore.
It's so unfortunate how many records are gone. We are very spoiled here in Loudoun County because our records have been very well cared for.
Absolutely.
Having done research elsewhere, like in South Carolina, we're doing very well here. Lori, a clarification. Somebody was curious. They want to be sure are people listed on the cohabitation register always free?
So what that was, it was a document or a recordation that the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War wanted done. And I'm speaking for Virginia. And it would be people, it was supposed to be for people who had been enslaved, who considered themselves married. Because of course, during the time of slavery, it was recognized in the community and even perhaps by the enslavers, but not legally, or recognized, it was recognized religiously. So this was a place for this legal recording to be done. And so at that point, everyone was free when the cohabitation registers were being taken and the names recorded, but it was for at least one of the people who had been enslaved during the time of slavery.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Lori. We have a few questions that I think you both can talk to about locating U.S. colored troops, the information about those ancestors that you found in both of your presentations. Could you talk a little bit about the process? I know we talked about Fold 3, and I think probably that's a great source to start with, but other help would be great.
Absolutely. I'll start, Lori. Fold 3, I was just beginning to type a response in here in the Q&A piece. And so I said the easy start is to look at Fold 3. That's the piece that's online. But, I think researchers, the web has made work seem very easy, in terms of being able to look for some of these records. And so I would urge you to start there because that's the easy way to do it. You don't have to get off your couch in order to do something. But that is the tip of the iceberg. So don't let that be the end all. So the other thing is that these records that are in Fold 3 have all been digitized that are part in the National Archives. So that's where you can, I've literally held my great-grandfather's pension records in my hands, which is just exhilarating to be able to think about, the pension application that he submitted for his service as a U.S. colored troop. But the other thing besides that is that the National Park Service, here's another thing that you look at, is the National Park Service actually has, manages the African American Civil War Memorial. And as a part of that, there is a database that basically lists, all of those that are listed in the memorial. And so if you had somebody that was in the U.S. colored troops, the chances are 99% chance that you'll actually find them in that list. And that then could lead you to the record that you want to be looking at in the archives. Lori?
And I don't have anything to add to that in terms of the military records, but another source in fold 3, and I wouldn't make it my primary search, but as you're going through the priority of records, I have found some interesting information in the Southern claims. And for that, you will probably need the names of, the white people, probably men, but not necessarily, but the white people in that area of the people you're researching. And so here's an example of an area I'm researching. One of the families submitted a claim, and these claims were to the government after the war. There's a certain period of time that they had to be made by. And so you describe what troops, Union troops, took stuff from your property, cattle, fence rails, whatever. And you were looking to get some money back. And you were the only people who were supposed to get any money back, and it would be small, were people who voted against secession. But that didn't stop the secessionists from submitting claims. And one in particular for a project I'm working on, in that Southern claim, in the claims, you have to bring witnesses forward to attest to certain things. And I discovered a formerly enslaved man who talked about, so I went through looking for the Southern claim for this man named Reuben Jenkins, but the enslaved man was talking about how he hid his enslavers' horses and cattle in the mountain when any of the troops came, because they didn't want to lose them. And so this formerly enslaved man is giving testimony to about this person who's submitting a claim. And it's very interesting information because I'm learning more about this man and who had enslaved him and a little slice of his life during the Civil War. So those are other documents that you will find on Fold 3 because they are related to the military.
Yeah, the other thing that I would recommend that may be a little bit longer shot is, local historical societies and things like that who are, managing information about the history of their state or county.
Excellent. Thank you. We've had a few questions, Steve, particularly about your presentation. You had some great ways to organize information visually, which as I think we can all appreciate with the complex information you're dealing with the DNA. Particularly, people were curious what you used to create the timeline that appeared in your presentation.
Well, I've done this multiple ways. I've got a relative, the person who was the husband of Cora that we talked about here. We have quite a bit of information about his life. And so what I've done is I built a spreadsheet that basically shows, all of his professions with the years going across the top so that I can follow when he was in the service. I can follow what his professions were, and I can see that at a glance. So I did that in a spreadsheet. The one that I showed you in the case study for William Syphax, I basically put that together as a Word document, and I turned it into a slide, and so it looks very elaborate, but it really is very simple. It's just a bunch of text boxes pulling together information that and arranging it in a way that makes sense to you. And so, there's no. I wish I had come up with a template, but there isn't one. And there may be templates out there that would help you, but think about just putting yourself. Start with a piece of paper and scraps of paper, and just begin to lay it out, and then craft it into what works for you. And I think that's part of the key here is find tools that work for you.
I think that's good advice. I will say that in September, the Balch is having another program that will be virtual, where Stephanie Seal, who works with digital humanities, will be talking about tools that you can use for similar things that she talks about mapping and timelines usually. I think she probably will, again, I can put a bug in her ear about that. So,
Well, and one more thing that I've seen, resource that Steve used was long rolls of freezer paper.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and he used that again when we were working on a joint project at the historic site, but long rolls of freezer paper.
You know, that's a really good point, Lori, and that works really well when you're kind of crowdsourcing. You know, one of the things when we first built that original poster that I showed you, the real colorful one, and remember that was version 2.0. Well, version 1. I would say 0.5 was really a long roll of paper that we began to just simply put the big branches together with. But you know what? When we had our first reunion, it became a crowdsourcing opportunity where everybody said, well, you know, this is how we're connected, or this is what my folklore says. And boy, I've got a picture here. And hey, here's what, you know, so-and-so got married here. And so it was a great catalyst for being able to pull information together to allow you to aggregate information from, you know, all your family members.
Cool. We did get a similar question for you, Steve, about any recommendations you have for sort of analyzing and aggregating the DNA information. Because I know you showed us information from both Ancestry and 23andMe, I think. So do you have a recommendation for things to combine and compare that data?
Yeah, a couple of things. And I want to reiterate that what I shared with you was a Pinky's, you know, snapshot of what has gone into that work there. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody who wants to learn more and go into more detail. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that people do test on different platforms. And so sometimes that's difficult. You know, Ancestry does not allow you to upload information from other places, and it also doesn't allow you to graph how your DNA is shared. So there are other tools that are out there to do that. But the reason I'll say this is that I focus on using autosomal DNA at Ancestry because it's by far the largest database that exists, you know, that has the most people in it. Right now, I just got a note here of the last week or so saying that they have more than 20 million people in the database. And the next closest one is probably around 9, you know, which is, I think, 23andMe. And then the others trail off beyond that. And so I've chosen to use Ancestry, but in doing so, I am asking people to share with me their raw results so that I can use that information in other tools. So one of the other really important tools for me is a database exchange which is called GEDmatch. And you may have heard about GEDmatch. Is that this is a database that is allows people to upload their information there, but it's also the database in which law enforcement has used to search for, you know, to break cold cases. But it allows you to, allow police to look at your results or not. So you can opt in or opt out of that. And for all of the stuff that we're doing at the present time, we've chosen to opt out. And the other thing that I would say is that when I'm using that database is I give everybody an alias. So there's no way for people to know whose database is there except for me and the person who has shared it with me. So I think places like GEDmatch, and then there's another tool that's out there that's called DNA Painter. And DNA Painter allows you to use raw results and create some of those graphs that I showed you that were real colorful, showing where we share DNA. But they also have some tools that allow you to consider what are the odds that somebody is a certain relationship. And so there's some cool things to do that. Again, that's called DNA Painter, and you can just Google it and you'll be able to find that.
Excellent, thank you. Great information. Well, I think there's a great question that follows up on both your presentations, where someone is asking what the best way and where they can share information about research they've done, enslaved individuals in Loudoun and Fauquier County. But I think both of you encouraged us to research with a buddy, which is always wonderful to have partners and to seek seek out other people who may be doing similar research. Do you have general suggestions for where to share your research or good places to reach out and find people who may be looking in the same areas?
Well, I would say, do you want to go first, Lori?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, well, I would start by saying, nearby here in Loudoun County, one place that we're beginning to have some of these conversations is the Black History Committee. I see that Alicia Cohen is basically watching here, and she has been doing a fantastic job of trying to engage members of the Black History Committee as we talk about, genealogy and family history. And so places like that are, it's really about a gathering place so that you can start to share those things. It's not quite as robust as other communities. So I would say, something like the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society is a place where, everybody there is interested in that kind of research. And so I'm actually the treasurer for the DC chapter of the John Dent Walker chapter of the African American History. It's called AUGS, Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. You can just Google that and find it. And then there are other, I would say, depending on what state or what county you're in, I belong to multiple societies or multiple groups. I belong to the Louisiana Historical Society, and so there are a number of places that I think it's worthwhile to get involved with because people are, as we were talking about, Lori and I sharing some interesting surnames that cross over. When you begin to join those kinds of groups, people are going to talk about the Joneses or the Smiths or the Johnsons, and you can say, hey, I got a Jones. And that becomes a trigger or an opportunity for you to have a conversation and pursue some of the things that you might have questions about.
And I would also look at, see what you can find in a Facebook group.
Yeah.
There,
Sure.
More and more are being formed, or maybe form one of your own, or someone who can help you get that started. Another thing that, and I realize it's difficult with repositories being closed or restricted because of the pandemic, but I know personally just being in a place and getting to know the people who work there, like the staff here at the Balch Library or at the courthouse, or the people you meet who are there who are also doing research. After, you're there enough times, you start making those connections, or somebody is there and says, oh yeah, I remember, somebody was in here researching the Glebe family. Let me put the two of you in touch. Or I can say at the courthouse, for example, not related to African American genealogy, but just 2 days ago, that somebody came in to research a family, and I was helping someone researching the same family via an email request, and they had never met each other. So we connected, we got permission and gave out each other's email addresses so that they could connect with one another. So I think some of it is like, being out there in the world in these places and researching once things start opening up and people know who you're researching.
Yeah. One of the other things that was on one of my last slides in terms of references was a reference to Maggie, the Midwest African American Genealogical Institute. So if you write that down and just Google Maggie, it's likely to show up. And this is a group that's being led by several just amazing women that are genealogical research professionals. Before COVID, this set of seminars was out in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is the second largest repository for genealogical information in America. Probably didn't know that, but it's second, right behind Salt Lake City. It's an amazing place, and basically it's a great way for you to meet other people who are perhaps at the same skill level that you are, but are also very inquisitive. So you're able to increase your network there as well. And these are people that are coming from all over the country, and they have conversations about, beginning genealogy. They have seminars on, Native American genealogy, on DNA. And so there's several different flights that several different portions or pieces that you can take each summer. And it's coming up pretty quickly here. I think it's at the end of this month. So registration may be closed at this point, but I would urge you to take a look at that because I think it's a just amazing resource.
I think we maybe answered all the questions. There's one about what the road cases were, but I think we can send that person some information. Let's see, did I just see one more question pop up? There's that message for L'Oreal. But if anybody has any last minute questions, if you go ahead and type them into the box. Otherwise, I'm going to join a lot of people who have been kind enough to share their thanks for this program and echo the sentiments. This was extremely comprehensive and the case studies were really wonderful. I learned a number of things that I'm going to go and investigate after this program. And I really hope that it's been useful to everyone. I think I can say definitely we appreciate both of you sharing this wealth of information. So thank you very much. And I guess I don't see any additional questions, and I will share everything in the chat and the Q&A with our presenters afterwards. So if they see something that they want to respond to that I missed, we'll get to it. But do you, Steve or Lori, have anything else to add?
No, just thank you, everyone, and please contact us if you have a question.
Absolutely. We're easy to reach here. We'd love to talk about this kind of stuff. As you can probably tell, I'd like to thank the Balch Library for hosting this and putting it together. And, you know, we need to find ways to help each other to solve these kinds of cases. There's a lot of history here to uncover or rediscover.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and look for an email from me maybe tomorrow morning with links to the information into the video. So thanks so much.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.